If the dollar were threatened, though, we have to ask by what? What's going to take its place? So for this plan to be profitable to the government within 20 years, which is the time period the law allows for which the Bitcoin purchase must be held, if it's going to be profitable after 20 years or in 20 years, Bitcoin's price has to increase by a factor of 2.5 during that time. If I say, for example, Bitcoin isn't money in most places, I'm not making a value. I'm not saying, therefore, Bitcoin is bad, but therefore, Bitcoin is worthless, or anything like that. In fact, I don't believe that either of those things is at all true. I'm merely saying,
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bitcoin Frontier podcast. This week we have on George Selgin. George, welcome.
Thank you, Joe. I'm enjoying the opportunity to be on your show.
Absolutely. We're glad to have you. Before we jump into Bitcoin, National Strategic Reserve, and so much else, let's hear more about like your professional background and like how did you get interested in economics, alternatives, monetary alternatives, and even Bitcoin?
Well, I'll try to answer that without taking up the whole show, Joe, because I know you want to talk about other stuff. My story about getting involved in economics is itself quite involved. Suffice to say that I had set my sights on a career in marine biology and was working toward a degree, not actually in that specialty, but in zoology, when my father said, "Oh, you ought to study economics." Now, my father never gave me serious advice. Go play in the streets is about as far as it got. So I thought, well, geez, sounds like he's actually not joking for a change. So I went ahead. I'd already taken one or two econ courses. I thought I liked them. So I ended up double majoring in econ and zoology. And to make a long story short, what with various efforts to combine the two things and blah, 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 I ended up becoming more interested in pure economics and monetary economics generally. My father was very disappointed in me for a while because turns out he wanted me to study economics because he hated free market economists, wanted his son to grow up to be one of their biggest nightmares. And of course, it didn't turn out to be that at all. But by the time he passed away, which is a quarter of a century ago now, he was actually rather proud of me, even was proud of my having a letter from Milton Friedman for my tenure. So it worked out okay, but it was a little rough for a while. Anyway, what I ended up doing was becoming interested in money and inflation, which is bringing us closer to home, the topics we want to talk about ultimately. And this was, remember, the early 1980s. I was in a grad program in marine resource economics in Rhode Island originally. And I became more and more interested in inflation and less interested. Well, honestly, I wasn't interested at all in the crap they were trying to teach me there. Very boring. And so I started reading everything I could get my hands on inflation and found a lot of it quite unsatisfactory, which I now know it was. Till I read, among other books that I thought were actually helping me understand things, I read Hayek. Well, I read Hazlitt's book on the inflation problem and how to resolve it. I'll tell you a quick story about that, story within a story. I kept that book and a bunch of others by Hazlitt, and I'd had them signed at one point. But when I left D.C., I still had them. I sold all my library for the second time in a few years to a used bookstore. They ended up selling the Hazlitt books to a British bookseller, and they're now available, those that haven't been sold, with the signatures and all, for £6,000 to £8,000 each. Yeah, how about that? Anyway, I read Hazlitt way back then, and I went on to read some more works by von Mises and Hayek. And of course, I read Denationalization of Money. And I thought, whoa, wait a minute, what's this? No government control of money would be better. So I got intrigued by that. I wasn't won over in one fell swoop. And I decided to start doing research on the topic myself. And somebody at the Institute for Humane Studies pointed out to me a graduate student named Larry White, who was then at UCLA finishing his dissertation. I contacted Larry White and ended up going to NYU to be his first student. So that's kind of how I ended up where I am.
That's really cool. And then I guess you taught at the University of Georgia as well.
Yeah, University of Georgia was the third place I landed in. I was kind of like a bad penny. Everybody was trying to get rid of me. So I survived for 3 whole years at George Mason before they gave me the heave-ho. Went to lick my wounds in Hong Kong for a year, and then with exquisite timing, got an offer to come to the United States to teach at the University of Georgia, literally days after returning from a visit to the mainland immediately following the Tiananmen massacre, which visit had me desperately wanting to get back to the United States. So naturally, when that offer came, I accepted it with alacrity. And Larry was by then teaching at University of Georgia, as was Dick Timberlake, and the two of them had conspired to create an opening for me to come. And then I managed, by the skin of my teeth, to get a tenure-track position at Georgia, which Dick Timberlake personally created for me by retiring. So I had good people who were helping me out as my guardian angels, as it were. That's how I ended up at Georgia for 25 years, because they couldn't get rid of me after that.
That's awesome.
They tried. And believe me, they tried.
That's so funny. Yeah, I know we were talking about it before we started recording, because that's University of Georgia is where I graduated from school. So it's cool to put out with you, even though we weren't.
I missed you, Joe. You came to University of Georgia as a freshman the year I left to go to Washington, D.C., to the Cato Institute, to join Cato. And as I was saying, I still work at the Cato Institute now, but I work remotely from Spain. And I got that deal by going to my boss at Cato and saying, look, if you let me live wherever I want to and work remotely, you can pay me a lot less. And I named a number that was considerably lower than my salary at the time. And he said yes so quickly that I felt like an idiot. I thought, could have asked for a raise. Because he seemed so anxious for me to leave. But anyway, I missed, when I moved to D.C., I really missed Athens, Georgia. I don't know how many of your listeners have ever been there, but that was a good town. If I had to live anywhere in the United States, I might well choose to go back there. It was a good place. It had a nice Victorian home and all that. You could live pretty well there. But now I'm in Spain, in Granada, and I'm very happy. No, I guess I can't complain.
Yeah, Spain sounds pretty good too, but Athens is definitely a special place.
Great town.
Yeah. I want to ask you kind of generally about like money and Bitcoin, and just not necessarily like definitions from your perspective, but like just how you think of them in general. Like if someone asked you the question, what is money? What would you say?
Well, for better or for worse, Joe, I'd give them the standard economist definition. And I want to step back a bit and explain myself. I don't believe in toying with definitions. I think in a way we kind of have to be slaves to definitions, where by definitions I mean the way most people are using any terms at any given time, particularly terms of art. That is, terms that have a specific meaning in a profession. You don't just go around defining them differently unilaterally, because then, of course, communication starts to get a little bit tricky. Let me just give another example that has nothing to do with the current dispute I've had with Bitcoiners. Another dispute, I have no shortage of disputes in my career, but another one I've had is with some Austrian economists who insist on using the term inflation to mean an increase in the money stock, and deflation also to mean a reduction in the money stock. Now, that's exactly what those terms meant. to economists as well as others. Oh, and then up till the 1930s. But their meanings changed. Their meanings changed. Now, when we speak of inflation, we mean an increase in some general index of output prices, the consumer price index, for example. And deflation means the opposite, a decline in that. Now, it's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing with those definitions. It's just that if I want to communicate, the most expeditious thing I can do is to say, okay, well, let's just use those terms the way certainly other people in our discipline use them. Not because it's better to use the words that way. Dictionaries are just convention. And when you go against them, it's like saying, hell, I want to drive when everybody else is driving on the right. It doesn't improve things. You might make a fancy argument. Oh, well, on the left would be better because of this, that, and the other thing. But you're still wiser. Stick with the majority in these. And I feel the same way about this. It's not that it's the only way you could possibly define it, but for better, for worse, better for worse. Economists' definition of money of long-standing is a generally accepted medium of exchange. And anticipating, they mean in any given community, right, in any given place, because, of course, things that are money in one place are not money in other place. And that's what the word means. That's just the way they use it. Is it the best definition? Probably not, because, definitions are ultimately somewhat arbitrary, aren't they? The name we give to a certain sound that we emanate, we make. Anyway, so I stick to that because it's prudent, easiest to do so. Do I attach any significance to it? If I say, for example, Bitcoin isn't money in most places, I'm not making a value. I'm not saying, therefore, Bitcoin is bad, but therefore, Bitcoin is worthless, or anything like that. In fact, I don't believe that either of those things is at all true. I'm merely saying that it doesn't meet this definition of money. That's all I'm saying. And I'm saying it because the definition is what it is and because Bitcoin is what it is. And by the way, people do make payments, drawing on their Bitcoin wealth all the time. But like foreigners traveling in a different country, they almost always, not always, rely on making an exchange between Bitcoin and whatever the local money actually is. I mean, do it very easily nowadays. It may be as invisible as paying with a credit card and your credit card company is doing it quietly for you. But they are actually using, in most cases, the local currency for the actual payment. That's what the sellers are actually receiving when you double click your phone.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. If you use that definition of money, obviously almost the entire world, Bitcoin is obviously not part of that definition. It's therefore not money according to that definition. So that makes sense to me. If someone asked you, like, what is a dollar, how would you answer that question?
Well, I would, again, do something very unoriginal. I would defer to the various measures of the U.S. money stock. I'm assuming that the person is asking me, what are dollars in the sense of monetary dollars? Of course, there are all kinds of dollar assets out there that nobody would consider money. But I think by dollars, most people mean, first of all, they mean a unit, the currency unit that is the official currency unit in the United States and always has been. And they mean the representatives of that unit, the more liquid ones anyway. And that's Federal Reserve notes, some coins, if you have enough of them. Obviously, if it's quarters, you need 4 and you got yourself $1. Various bank deposits and so on, how far you go with that so on depends on how generous you want to be, how loose you want to be with respect to the qualification generally accepted, which is intentionally fuzzy, because money is one of those things where you really can't draw a hard line between monetary and non-monetary assets that everyone will agree with. So you hedge, we hedge, economists hedge, bankers hedge. By having several definitions, some of which are a little stricter, some of which are a little wider. And by the way, there's hardly anything in any economy that is money all the time for everyone, even though it has to be generally accepted. If you said it had to be universally accepted, you'd have a hard time finding anything. So I can't use my penny to pay my mortgage. On the other hand, I can't use a large denomination note to pay my bus fare, right? So almost anything that might qualify as money is not likely to be universally accepted. So this generally accepted is fuzzy on purpose. It has to be.
That makes sense. If someone asked you the question, what is gold? How would you answer that one as well?
Oh, that's easy. Gold's a commodity. It's not money anywhere. Not money anywhere. It's amazing to me as an economist, what with my silly definitions that I'm stuck with or that I even believe in. Gold doesn't conform to the definition of money anymore, despite a long history of serving that role in many places at many times. It was money in the United States before 1971, and to some extent, and certainly before 1934, when Americans could still actually own gold coin. But it hasn't been money since 71 here, and it hasn't been money anywhere for mostly since the Great Depression for almost the whole rest of the world, which went off the gold standard, if it had been on it, went off the gold standard during the Great Depression. We were the only ones that cobbled together a kind of pseudo-gold standard after the Depression, wherein the U.S. dollars once again became claimed to gold, though only foreign monetary authorities could actually have gold in exchange for them at that time. And then Nixon shut the gold window famously in 1971, and that was that. Gold remains today an important hedge against inflation, apart from its other uses as a commodity for electronics and jewelry and so on. And I should mention, because people will wonder about it, yes, the U.S. government holds a tremendous stock of gold, 8,133 metric tons of it. And that, of course, might make people think that gold must still perform an essential function in our economy officially. But the reality, as I've written, is that that gold is mostly just a legacy of the fact that the dollar was once redeemable in gold, plus the reluctance of our monetary authorities to unload this stuff for all kinds of reasons.
Secure your retirement with a Bitcoin IRA from Unchained. Right now, get started with no setup fees and enjoy your first year free. You can open a Roth and traditional Bitcoin IRA and even upgrade old forgotten 401ks and IRAs into tax-advantaged Bitcoin where you control the keys. Get started today at unchained.com/frontier. There's no better way to hold tax-advantaged Bitcoin for decades. That's unchained.com/frontier. And now back to the show.
But it's a hangover. It's a vestige. It is the gold we have today is our money today, is essential to our monetary system today, no more than our coccyxes are essential to our being human beings. They're the vestigial parts of tails that at some point back in the evolutionary process, what became human beings used to possess.
The last question that I have on like just general definitions is, from your perspective, what is Bitcoin?
Bitcoin? Well, in an article I actually first wrote I think it was the end of 2011, believe it or not. It got published some years later, but I wrote it back then. It's an article called Synthetic Commodity Money. What I said there was that if Bitcoin became money, it would defy all the usual classifications of money. Well, actually, mainly the dichotomy between commodity money on one hand and fiat money on the other. And I think your listeners know the difference. And I said, we need a new name for this if it becomes money, or wherever it, to be fair, wherever it, right? let's say Bitcoin's money knows on. By the stupid economist definition, what kind of money is it? It's what I call synthetic commodity money. It has some features that resemble commodity money, mainly the fact that it's inevitably scarce. Its scarcity is not contrived in the sense that it can be changed. Its scarcity is inevitable. There are never going to be more than 21 million Bitcoins. It's like the amount of gold in the ground and on Earth, complete, it cannot change. So it resembles a scarce commodity in that, even though its scarcity is synthetic. And on the other hand, it resembles fiat money in there not being any obvious commodity use. You can't fill people's teeth with it. You can't make jewelry. It's strictly a financial asset, which is unusual. And so synthetic commodity is what I would call it. Synthetic commodity. It's a fascinating thing, this synthetic commodity. It's not the only one now, of course. It used to be, it was the first. And gives it, as I also said in that old article, gives it attributes that are themselves very desirable. That is, in principle, you could make a better money, by economist definition of the term, using that consists of such a synthetic commodity than we can ever hope to have by relying on fiat money or by using some actual natural commodity. We could, in principle, have something that behaves a lot better. It's not subject to undesirable supply shocks, not subject to commodity demand shocks, not subject to the whim of authorities, and so on. And it was these features of the synthetic commodity known as Bitcoin that really attracted me back then, and that still attract me to general class that I call synthetic commodity. So that's what Bitcoin is. Now, in most places, doesn't conform to economists' stupid definition of money. I'm going to call it stupid every time I say it so that your listeners don't have to do it. Save them some trouble, right? It doesn't conform to that. But it is, of course, an asset, a financial asset that has become extremely popular. And owing to that popularity, has become a very successful investment asset. If you look, of course, at the long-term trend in its value, it's been appreciating like mad. The irony there is an irony there, is that, I'll say unfortunately, the very fact that it has turned into such a good investment asset has itself detracted from its potential merit as a medium of exchange. In the most obvious way, without going into any macroeconomics, the most obvious way it's done that is that people don't want to spend it. So even if they could, they don't want to. That's why we have hodlers. So if nobody wants to spend it, if it's more economical to spend something else, the fiat that's around, and to hold on, to hodl, well, then of course that's making the likelihood that this Bitcoin takes off as a generally accepted medium of exchange lower, even regardless of what happens to sellers' willingness to accept it, or to technology that allows it to be used, even if sellers aren't willing. So Bitcoin's success as an investment medium, a hedge against inflation, whatever you'd like to call it, but it boils down to a heck of a rate of return, somewhat undermines its potential to take off as a medium of exchange, which, let's all recognize, was what its founders had in mind. There are macroeconomics as well, why you wouldn't necessarily want to have something that's appreciating rapidly as your medium of exchange and unit of account. That can raise serious macroeconomic problems. But even apart from that, we have a bit of a dilemma. We can either have a really good investment medium, or we can have a successful medium of exchange, generally accepted medium of exchange. It's hard to have both. It's not a coincidence, in other words, that most of the world's monies haven't been things that appreciated like mad, at least not while they were used as money. Gold started to appreciate like mad after money ceased to be based upon it, because people realized it made a good hedge against that appreciation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I guess from your perspective, does it make sense, like from an individual's perspective, to ever decide to save a specific commodity or even a synthetic commodity? And if so,
Yeah, of course.
fair.
I mean,
If
look,
so, like how?
in
So go
hindsight,
ahead.
in hindsight, who now could say it doesn't make sense to hold on, to accumulate, to hoard, to hodl Bitcoin? Who can say that in hindsight? I mean, it's, I think it's a little harsh to say to people who didn't think it was a good idea 10 years ago that they were idiots. They could properly point to the risk involved, the volatility of the price, which still remains a fact. But in hindsight, of course, Bitcoin's been one of the best investments people could make. So, hey, who's going to gainsay that? Now, I'm not making predictions for it, but of course, it could continue to go up. I've never, even though people wrongly equated me with an anti-Bitcoin person because I say it doesn't meet the stupid definition of money. In fact, I've never been one of those people who said, "Oh, Bitcoin isn't worth what the market says it's worth," or "Bitcoin's going to crash any day now," or "Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme." I've never said any of those, and I haven't said them because I don't believe them. I do believe that the price of Bitcoin is volatile. I do believe it could crash. I also believe it could keep going up. I believe all those things are possible. It's the nature of a synthetic commodity that you don't really, you don't really have any. There's no underlying commodity value, non-financial asset, non-investment value there that's going to put a bottom to the price. But then again, there's no top either. Nothing obvious. And as everybody who's listening to your show knows, of course, the fact that the scarcity of Bitcoin is absolutely written in stone, that, of course, a reason why if it continues to become popular, the prices can only go up.
When it comes to like evaluating Bitcoin, whether it's a synthetic commodity or an actual commodity, how, as from your perspective, like how can you determine whether one will appreciate or depreciate over time? Like, are there specific properties that maybe make it, or no?
There's none. I'm a believer, loosely speaking anyway, in the efficient markets hypothesis. I think the best prediction of Bitcoin's price is where it is. And that is, if in fact there were some solid reason, let's say that we could scientifically say it's going to go up 100% in a year, hell, it would go up right away, wouldn't it? Unless somehow you and I are the only ones who figured it out. I know in my case that's quite unlikely. But whenever anything is certain to other people too, or it probably is. So I don't have much patience with people who say on Twitter and elsewhere to me, Bitcoin's going up to, 1 million in such and such an amount of time. So wait a minute, there are pretty open capital markets out there. Go ahead and make a leveraged buyout. And some people will. If enough people believe it, they will. And the price will go up now. The fact that it's not going up now means that whoever's saying that is a little bit, out there on a limb, right? It can't have many other people agreeing with them. So, no, I don't think there's any scientific way to beat markets. I think you can occasionally, smart entrepreneurial people beat market at a time, but I don't think that it's a matter of science. I think that they have, sometimes they have a little more information at their hand. Sometimes they just have a better sense of where things are going. And I don't think anybody's ever written a handbook that tells you how to acquire that ability. It's uncanny. That's all. And entrepreneurial ability is an uncanny thing. I profess to having none, but I'm not going to go around like some economists and say, I confidently know that Bitcoin's going to crash, because that too would require that I have an unusual amount of entrepreneurial insight, if it were correct, but probably means I'm just making one more wrong prediction about Bitcoin crashing, and we've had enough of those. You don't need mine.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that like timing the markets, especially in the short term, is pretty much impossible and probably most likely mistaken for luck, throughout history.
Everybody, most of the time when people claim, they point back at some prediction that they made that turns out to be true. Almost inevitably, if you go and look at their record, you'll find that they've been making the same prediction for years, or that they make a different prediction every day or whatever. And then they remind you of the times, usually relatively few, when they got it right, and they make hay with it. Because unfortunately, as P.T. Barnum says, there's a sucker born every minute.
Yeah, it's not that makes sense. Thinking about like the efficient market hypothesis in general, like how would economists think about Bitcoin's performance? Like Bitcoin, over the last, like you pointed out, like it's performed exceptionally well for 15 years at this point. Compound annual growth rate is like 100% over the last 14 years or whatever it might be. Like, what's the rationale behind that? Like, would it be luck?
Good economists don't second guess market development. They would say that this is a fascinating development, that it's very interesting. They would try to study it. They'd try to get a handle on why it's happened. But it's not the business of our discipline to try to dissect every market movement or market phenomenon and try to rationalize it. It's like trying to rationalize vanilla versus chocolate ice cream. People have their subjective values and their hunches, and people get entangled in various fads, and or they become enthusiastic about things, whether for rational reasons or otherwise. Economists just consider all of this data very, very interesting, but I don't think that they have a lot to say. And they certainly don't have much to say about it normatively. It's what it is. It's what it is. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's not wrong. It's not right. It's not irrational. It's just that this financial asset has gained a following. The following has grown like topsy. The price is growing along with it. Might not keep on growing. Things have their limits, and it might crash. We're a long way from being in any situation to confidently predict where it is headed. And it's the business of investment guru types to try to make such predictions. They do it all the time. But the reason they do it, and economists don't do it, is because, to be blunt, economics is a scientific discipline and knows, or should know, where the limitations of its knowledge are. And those limitations are such that we do not have any equipment prepares us or allows us to predict the future price of any asset. We can only examine where it's been and try to understand why in retrospect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess for this particular framing, or I'll say something and say, like, do you disagree with the framing, or do you just say, like, as an economist, you would take like an unbiased approach to this? Like, I think some people would say like Bitcoin is a tool or a synthetic commodity that has unique properties. It's scarce, portable, durable, divisible, etc. Right? And the world is potentially actively like converging on that and deciding to save this synthetic commodity. Would you say like that's incorrect framing, or you're more?
I think it's incorrect framing, Joe, because you use the expression "the world," and the world includes a lot of people who aren't doing those things. That's all. The Bitcoiners have to remember that there are still a hell of a lot of non-Bitcoin people out there who don't own any of it, aren't so far interested in owning any of it, and so no, we don't want to airbrush them out of our portrayal of reality. So that is not to disparage the people who have been involved in the Bitcoin movement and who have accumulated Bitcoin, who think it's a good investment, and who, as I've said, have done very well in many. They held on to it long enough. Not to disparage them at all. In retrospect, everyone who's bought Bitcoin a while ago and held on to it until now or for a long time has done very well, and probably better than most people who did with the similar investment capacity. But that's easy to say in hindsight, but it doesn't tell us anything about the future. Now, of course, and I know we're getting to this, if developments like this proposed strategic Bitcoin reserve take off, that arguably arguably could boost the price of Bitcoin considerably. Though, mind you, the price will go up when the market is convinced that it's going to happen, not when the actual plans do happen. It's an important distinction. And then, of course, if anything prevents them from happening, the price is going to come right back down again, according as people's expectations to be disappointed. But while there are developments, economists like me can say, if they happen, then the price will do such and such, at least naming the direction. That's about it. Confidently expounding on potential future developments. We can't do much better than that.
I do kind of want to get into strategic Bitcoin reserve talk. But first, I guess, like, ignoring Bitcoin, do you think it's ever possible that the US dollar would potentially get disrupted or, even potentially replaced by some other monetary alternative?
Anything's possible, Joe, especially if we're willing to allow it to take a long, long time. There are plenty of fiat monies that seem likely to die in the not too distant future, and others that are, let's say, struggling. The dollar is one of them, despite the recent inflation, which was bad. The fact is that the dollar has a very, very, very big established network, not just the U.S. economy, but much of the rest of the world, and it's the number one currency in international trade. And it's not being rivaled by any other currency. People are pointing to statistics that the share of dollars in international reserves has been falling lately. That's been true for quite a few years now, about 20 years. But what they don't notice, or don't point out, is that the share is falling, but no other major currency is rising in global role. Gold has gained ground. Some minor currencies have gained ground. They're not going to take over the dollar. No way. So the dollar's still, it simply isn't threatened. Now, that's the first point. If the dollar were threatened, though, we have to ask by what? What's going to take its place? Now, for all kinds of reasons, I think Bitcoin wouldn't be a front runner to take its place, not only because it's got a small network compared to, say, the euro, which is number 2 in international exchange. It's like 20% of the dollar's 59 or 60. But if I were to guess, I would say even currencies like the Canadian dollar would be more likely to take off. If I were an American right now worried that I couldn't buy U.S. dollars, I think the Canadian dollar would be the most convenient thing to substitute into, assuming it wasn't going, circling the bowl at the same point. So, currency substitution is a funny thing, and not easy to make predictions about. But generally speaking, people move into other currencies that have big networks. And the only other consideration is the extent to which they might be close approximations compatible with their existing currency, so that you don't have a lot of confusion in the transition. Now, the problem is that our experience with this sort of thing is very limited. It consists entirely, pretty much, of other countries that having their currencies go down the drain and switching to the U.S. dollar. So what we don't have is any experience with what happens when the dollar itself expires, or as it does. So we don't have any experience with what is going to take over. We can only say that when fiat monies had died in the past, the dollar was the most likely thing that would take their place if no specific plans for replacing them with other substitutes were present. That's about all we can say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like if the dollar did start to fail, and like you said, like all the other fiat currencies are kind of failing before the dollar, would it be reasonable to expect us to converge on like some sort of like neutral, asset that nobody can print or create more of very easily, or no?
It would make sense. In that dire situation, I think that people probably right now would be using the precious metals, gold, silver. We shouldn't forget about silver, which was an important monetary metal for as much monetary history as gold, and more recent history than gold. Though people somehow have forgotten it, but silver would be a contender, and so would gold. I'm not speaking about the merits of either of these, but I think that they're both very salient as alternatives, and more so to this point than Bitcoin. Bitcoin might be, a runner-up here, but that is changing. That will change, and Bitcoin could be at some point could be the top contender for emergency backstop money, if not only the dollar, but every other fiat currency in the world is going blocko. And that and a couple bucks will get you a cappuccino.
When you evaluate like Bitcoin versus gold versus silver versus some other monetary metal, like how did you come to that conclusion of like gold maybe, silver maybe?
Only the
maybe.
Salience. If that's strictly a matter of the salience of the different metals, gold has been perceived as a monetary metal for a long time, and people have held it as a hedge against depreciation of fiat monies for a long time. So it has a front runner advantage, let's say. And that advantage is somewhat dependent on the demographics. Younger people are less inclined to think of the dollar as the lifeboat you jump to when your other monies fail than older people are. So, as I said before, this can change. It could be that someday, maybe not in the very distant future, the first thing that comes to people's mind if they contemplate a scenario where their official currency becomes no longer tolerable and there's no other official currency that makes for a practical substitute, Bitcoin may well become the thing that first comes to most people's minds. So that can change. But I think right now gold is probably still has the edge on it. And silver may. Silver is less clear.
I'm curious now to hear your thoughts on the proposed Bitcoin strategic reserve. Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it's a bad idea? How do you even think about that concept in general?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a bad idea. I'm on record more or less saying that it's a bad idea. I have two long essays, and they do two different things. One of them addresses the specific argument that's actually been made by every proponent of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, every serious proponent that I'm aware of, and that's the argument that this will help, believe it or not, prop up the dollar. Now, the first thing to note about that is that it's very ironic. It's ironic to be thinking of Bitcoin as something that's going to save the US dollar, because this was not the intent of Satoshi or any of the other founders of Bitcoin, wherever they were. It was meant to be a substitute for the dollar, an alternative, independent of any government and so on. Be that as it may, all the proponents of the strategic Bitcoin reserve have said, well, this is the purpose of the U.S. government buying all this Bitcoin. And I'm here, by the way, I'm only talking about proposals that would have the government buy a lot more Bitcoin. I'm not concerned with the proposal that Trump has made, or the promise he has made to simply have the government keep the Bitcoin that it has. Okay, fine. I'm not criticizing that. I don't think that it is as wrong-headed a plan as those that would have the government buy 1 million or 4 million Bitcoin. But people who would have the government do that have said it would shore up the dollar. And it won't do any such. Why? Because fundamentally, the dollar's value doesn't depend on the assets of the U.S. government. Fundamentally, it's independent. It is a pure, free-floating fiat money, the value of which is a function of the quantity supply confronted with people's need for exchange media. That's it. And their willingness to treat it as an investment asset, somewhat limited. Well, of course, dollar-denominated bonds or interest-earning bonds, very important investment. But as a medium of exchange, uh, the demand for dollars is, of course, not so dependent on its rate of return. Anyway, the dollar's value doesn't depend on the reserve. And what's funny here is neither does Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin's value doesn't depend on the wealth of Bitcoin. It doesn't depend on the wealth of Bitcoin holders. It depends on supply and demand. And so, it's ironic that people imagine that the dollar is going to retain its value better if there's a strategic Bitcoin reserve. There is a huge gold reserve, as I mentioned before, and some people have mistakenly assumed that that's there to prop up the value of the dollar. But as I explained, that's not so. So once you know that the gold isn't doing that, it's easier to understand that a big Bitcoin strategic reserve won't do it either. Now, what's true of the United States, this is important, isn't true of other countries. Other countries need foreign exchange reserves, and they also need gold. That is, they have good reasons for holding both. But that's because many of them want to maintain stable exchange rates with the dominant world currency, which is US dollar. For that, they need to hold dollars. And if they hold dollars, they're subject to exchange rate risk. So they hold gold as a hedge. So for other countries, central banks and monetary authorities, having exchange control, foreign exchange can be important. Having gold can be important, can be a valuable part of their conduct of monetary policy. The U.S. has none of those motives. Now, so as far as that's concerned, there's no case for a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The other thing I point out is that the strategic Bitcoin reserve plan, the specific plan of that's involved in the Bitcoin Act before. That's the only one that's really been spelled out in any detail. That's an actual piece of legislation that was introduced earlier this year. That plan's not cheap. The government, it's not cheap because to acquire the 1 million Bitcoins that the plan proposes that the government require within 5 years actually involves borrowing. It's a subtle form of borrowing, and you won't know it unless you're familiar with the workings of the Federal Reserve System today. But in fact, whatever the purchase price of the 1 million Bitcoin is, the government will be borrowing that and will be paying an actually pretty high rate of interest because it's borrowing directly from the Fed, but indirectly it's borrowing from banks, and it's paying them the interest rate on bank reserves it'll create in the process of buying these Bitcoins. And that's going to cost, it's going to cost 1.5 times the value of the Bitcoin purchased, approximately, in interest, not principal. So that for this plan to be profitable to the government within 20 years, which is the time period the law allows for which the Bitcoin purchased must be held. If it's going to be profitable after 20 years or in 20 years, Bitcoin's price has to increase by a factor of 2.5 during that time, 2.5. And that can happen. That can happen. But if it goes up any less, we lose money. That is, the government ends up more in debt to start. So a risky proposition, which again is not clear. If you read the law, you won't see anything about a loan. You won't see anything about interest. You will see people saying the national debt goes up, and that's true. It doesn't go up. But that's only true because bank reserves, which will be created here by this act, don't count as part of the national debt, even though the government owes those banks interest on all the reserves. So it's not a safe proposition. It's a risky one, and it isn't going to help the U.S. dollar. Now, there have been other arguments made for it. Of course, the argument that it'll help pay off the national debt only works if Bitcoin appreciates enough. It has to, again, go up by more than 2.5 the purchase price times the purchase. There are other arguments. There's an argument. Some people are comparing the strategic Bitcoin reserve to our strategic oil reserves. But Bitcoin's not a commodity that we might fear running out of. And if the government doesn't have any oil, if the nation doesn't have any oil, a lot of things grind to a halt. You can't say that that's going to happen if the government, not we, but the government runs out of Bitcoin. What is it that the government needs to do that it has to have Bitcoin? All right. And remember now, none of this isn't about individuals investing in Bitcoin. On the contrary, there's more Bitcoin out there for individuals than if the government doesn't buy up supply or some other large amount, 20th of the supply. It depends. Kennedy's plan, Senator Kennedy, he wanted the government to buy 4 million Bitcoin, which really is almost a fifth. But Loomis's plan calls for only 1 million, but that's still a big chunk. I want to emphasize there are good reasons, perfectly valid reasons for individuals acquiring Bitcoin and treating it as a desirable investment and gambling on it's going up and perhaps going up a lot. But for the government to make such decisions, to place similar bets, that's a higher bar that requires a lot stronger justification. Because, as we mentioned before, there are a lot of people who aren't interested in investing in Bitcoin, and here the government would be essentially investing public funds. In the democracy, you have to make a strong case for doing something with other people's money. That is not the same case you have to make if someone wants to do it themselves with their own.
Yeah, that was a really interesting breakdown in general. What do you think would happen if Loomis's bill or even like Kennedy's extreme bill actually got passed? Like, I know some people have brought up that they think it would strengthen the dollar. Obviously, you disagree with that. Would it weaken the dollar? Would it, incite like panic to some extent to converge?
I don't think it would have any obvious direct bearing on the dollar, but if it doesn't pay off and if we end up deeper in debt, this is bad news for the dollar. So it's placing a gamble, right? Could make the dollar worse because it could mean greater indebtedness. And it's not the direct connection. It's just that when countries are deeper in debt, as we've seen from recent experience, they tend to resort more to inflation. So we don't want that what happen. And there is some risk that it could happen. Apart from that, the only thing that are obvious are that if the government were to take part in those schemes, the price of Bitcoin, or if it were anticipated that it would, the price of Bitcoin would go up a lot, perhaps, very much in the case of Kennedy's proposal. And you certainly would have winners from that process who are holding Bitcoin would be among the winners in that. But that, of course, those gains are themselves not an argument for the government doing such a thing. Anytime the government subsidizes any commodity or industry, it benefits the people who hold the commodity or who are involved in that industry. But this is always a resource transfer, right? The increased wealth that those people enjoy, the increased purchasing power means they get more of the world's goodies than anybody else, or than other people who are not part of that deal. So you can't really justify Bitcoin strategic reserve simply by pointing out that certain groups will benefit from it. Of course, hardly anything the government can do ever that doesn't have its beneficiary. But in this case, it's surely not obvious that the public as a whole will end up better off. And by the public here, I mean Americans. And it's quite possible that they could end up generally worse.
Very interesting. George, this has been, I know we're already over time. This has been a really interesting conversation. Do you have any closing thoughts or advice for Bitcoiners or Bitcoin enthusiasts, going forward?
I have one piece of advice. Be nice to me. I'm on your side, at least compared to a lot of other people. I will also say, unless jocularly, I still have a lot to learn. I know you guys can teach me stuff, and I might fight like a trapped tiger sometimes on Twitter and elsewhere. It doesn't mean I don't wake up the next morning not knowing any more than I knew before.
Fair. All right, everyone, you heard him. And I agree. We should be nice to George. George is a smart guy and he's on our team.
Thank you.
George, of course. George, thanks again. This was awesome. Where can the audience go follow you or learn more about some of the work that you've done?
Well, besides Twitter, which I keep calling Twitter, I mean X, of course. Besides that, I write occasional essays for Cato at Liberty, and also post most of those on Substack if people prefer to follow that. And I have a bunch of books that you can find at Amazon and or online. Now, I have a new book coming out in April on the Great Depression and the New Deal, which I'd love to have everybody consider because I think it gives a very different perspective on the role the New Deal played in recovery from the Great Depression. This is a big question that people keep debating about, and I think I have a valuable take on that. Just absolutely pickled if any of your audience would go read that book when it comes out in April. And better still, if they would make advance orders, which a publisher will be excited to get.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely have to check that out. But George, thanks again. This is great.
Thanks a lot, Joe.